Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by HR software provider Cypher in partnership with Charity Digital. Today we're looking at how HR teams in the charity sector can make blended working a success. I'm Catherine Newbury, Cypher's Head of Content and Community. So joining me today is Jonathan Chevallier, CEO at Charity Digital. Hi Jonathan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Catherine, great to be here today and great to be speaking to everybody. As Catherine says, I'm CEO of Charity Digital and we're a charity, which kind of tells you what we do in the name actually. We help other charities to be more digital, but I'll say more about that in a minute.
Okay, thanks so much. If you don't know Cypher, we're a specialist provider of SaaS, HR, payroll and learning software through our HCM platform Cypher Connect. Cypher Connect is designed to provide a frictionless people experience across an organisation's entire employee lifecycle. It also enables seamless integration, not only with Cypher's own solutions, but also to an ecosystem of specialist third-party tools using our API. Here's a look at today's agenda. We're going to look at how Charity Digital responded to the pandemic in their approach to office and hybrid working, the highs and lows of remote working, the essential tech you need to make blended working a success, the operational enablers of blended working, and we're going to look at information security as well. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be emailed to you tomorrow, that's November 24th if you're watching live. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Jonathan now.
Thanks, Catherine. So I guess to start off, I said I'd say a little bit more about Charity Digital. So we were founded in 2001, so we've been around 20 years now, which is actually quite a long time in this game. And as I said, what we do is we help other charities to be more digital. We do this through two key programs. One is providing access to technology. So we have a number of special deals with tech major companies, which provides that technology, typically significantly discounted. Sometimes it's donated by the vendor or sometimes it's just heavily discounted. So that's all through our program called the Charity Digital Exchange. And the other is providing a lot more education, information and guidance about how you actually use digital technology to be more successful as a charity. And we're not a huge organization, so we grew from 15 to 19 people through the pandemic. And I guess what I'm going to be doing today is really giving you the CEO's view on blended working. So taking some of the lessons that came out of the pandemic, both the good and the bad during our period of extended remote working, and combining that with what I think is the best of actually face-to-face working as well, to try and come up with the optimal approach. So I'm not approaching this as an HR professional. I'm not an HR professional myself, but as an organization leader and what I think the HR considerations are. I'd be very happy to take questions. We can either take those at the end, but if there's anything immediate that applies to a slide as I'm going through it, I'm kind of happy for that to be flagged on the chat, and then Catherine will raise that to me at the end of the slide and I'll try and answer it. So I wanted to start off by giving you a bit of a sense of how working pattern has actually changed over the last 2 years since the onset of the pandemic. So this is going back to pre-pandemic. We were largely office-based. We actually had, we'd kind of already established the principle that people could work from home 1 day a week. So that's what this calendar here shows you, with all the employees in on a Monday, because we always had a all-hands meeting on a Monday, but any other day of the week, someone might choose to work from home. We had some big events that we ran. So at the top on this screen, you can see our Be More Digital conference, which we ran early in 2020, and that was a face-to-face event. And when we did our internal meetings, which were all face-to-face, then we used to have a stand-up on a Monday morning. We'd stand up and gather around this board, and that's what you can see on the bottom right-hand side of the screen as well. And I'll talk a lot more about how we did that and how we used what I call OKRs, or objectives and key results, as a part of that. So that'll come up later. Going to the next slide. So this is us mid-pandemic. So like most other office-based organizations, we'd moved to entirely working from home. And that pattern largely continued through till September, actually September of this year. But we never quite formally closed the office because our office is a serviced office. The landlord kind of maintained a skeleton staff to remain everything to be open. So we always had a view that if staff needed to go to the office, they could, or if they wanted to go, they could, although that was also subject to government lockdown restrictions. So what this meant, though, for most of the time, everyone was at home, and that's what you can see on the example calendar here. That meant all our meetings moved online. So our Monday morning all hands meeting, that obviously moved online as well. And that nice little whiteboard that we used to write things on, that pretty quickly pivoted into an Excel sheet that we shared over SharePoint, so everyone could access it remotely. And then if we go to where we are now, so we're now in blended working. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, we're looking to bring back face-to-face events. So we're bringing back our conference, which will be in March 2022. Though we're still continuing with some virtual events, but we're looking to have a blend of those. So some are virtual, some are face-to-face. Blended working for us, and I'll say more about how we got to this, means that employees are expected to be in the office 2 days a week. And the way that works is one day is a team day, which is mandated to employees. So for example, team 1 in on a Tuesday, team 2 in on a Wednesday, and one day is free choice. So you pick which day you go in. We're aiming to keep the office reasonably well spaced out. So we've kind of got a view of maximum of 50% occupancy. So you can see a very sparse office in that photo there. It's based on first come, first served in terms of booking in to take that. And we try and keep it well ventilated as well. But the idea of having the second day free and unmandated when it is we try and create a little bit of crossover between teams. Because otherwise, if we just focus on making everything a team day, one half of the organisation would never meet the other half. So that's just to give you a sense of where we're at now in terms of the journey we've been on and now being in blended working. So what I want to do is a quick poll now. And I want to try and understand a little bit more about your organisation's current working pattern. So I've got 5 choices here. So are you working more or less full-time in the office or your organisation facilities? It might be that you always did this, or it might be that you've returned to that since the end of the pandemic. Are you in a pattern where you're expecting people to work 3 or 4 days per week in the office? So the majority of their time, but you're offering some work from home opportunities still. Are you more like we are in Charity Digital? So you're saying, 1 to 2 days per week in the office and rest at home? Or is it entirely down to staff to choose their mix of home and office? Or are you still actually largely with the kind of previous lockdown regime where you say, we want staff to be at home nearly all of the time? So if you go ahead and do that, that'd be great. If you want to make any comments on this poll as well, just to explain your choice or provide any kind of colour to it, do feel free to use the chat as well.
Okay, lovely. We've got nearly all the votes in, so I'm just going to close the poll. 3 more seconds. The last try goes. Okay, close it and share those results, which you'll see on screen now. So actually half of our attendees today, Jonathan, are in a similar pattern to you at Charity Digital. They're expecting staff to be in the office for 1 or 2 days a week. 30% are allowing staff to choose whether they work at home or in the office, and just 20% say that staff are nearly working at home nearly all the time. What's your view on those results?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I guess it says that what we've done in Charity Digital is kind of the norm across most organisations at the moment, but there are still some who are clearly working from home. It's interesting though that the thing that really stands out is no one has at this stage gone to a kind of like, we're just largely going back to the office to where we were before pre-pandemic, which is actually my expectation. I don't think that we're going to see a mass return at any time. You know, I think this is permanent. I think this is here to stay. And I say that as a CEO of an organization where I can see absolutely no reason to go back full time, or as we were, 4 days a week. But I'll say a little bit more about that as we move along.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. I'll hide those results and we'll move on to the next slide.
So for me, thinking about how to make blended working really work well, it was great to reflect on actually our experience of remote working. You know, what worked well, what didn't work so well. So this is just it's not entirely my subjective view, it's mainly my subjective view, although we actually did an employee survey at the end of August into early September of this year. So that has fed into this as well. And I've got a few more results from that, which I'll directly share in a minute. So let's talk about recruitment and hiring in lockdown and remote working. I think for us, this was a really mixed experience. On the positive side, we found that interviewing over Zoom was super time effective, both for us as the recruiting organization. And I think it's super time effective for interviewees as well, because they don't obviously have to spend time traveling to a location of the interview. It was also, as a result of that, actually made scheduling people in much easier as well. So that was great. But when I reflect on it, the thing that has been a problem is we've not found that recruitment's been particularly successful. So I've had quite a bit of attrition of people who've been recruited either immediately before or during that period of remote working. I think as with everything, there's probably a combination of reasons for this. I think maybe some of those people just took a job because they were desperate. They maybe weren't really interested in what we did. They didn't necessarily want to be with us longer term. They just wanted a job for the money. And I guess it's always hard to detect that. And it's an important point, I think, for us to continue to reflect on how we interview to test people's kind of motivations and commitment to us as an organization. I think the ease of interview, so the fact that people don't have to travel, is actually a double-edged sword, because traveling to an interview is a kind of a test of the recruit's commitment, because you're not maybe going to bother to travel to something that you're only tangentially interested in. Whereas when it's super easy, it's kind of like, yeah, I'll jump on that call. Oh, I've got an offer. Well, I haven't got anything else. I'll take it. So I actually wondered whether that played against us as well. And I guess I'm just not quite so. You can ask great questions, you know, and we've reflected a lot on how we tune up the questions we're asking to drive out better evidence, because I'm really into the whole concept of very evidence experience-based interviewing. So you can tune that and make that better and better, but I'm still not convinced that it's some of the sense, the non-verbal, and I know you can see people's faces and stuff like that, obviously over Zoom, so you can get a bit of it, but I still think you get a better sense of that when you're face to face. So I do think you get a better sense when you meet someone, and you tend to maybe have just a little bit more what I call side chat around the meeting and greeting, and you just get to kind of see how they are in that context as well. So I do feel not having any face-to-face does weaken the interviewing process a bit as well. So I guess my longer term approach is probably to say ideally we'd actually maybe use a blend. So remote interviews for first stage, second interviews face-to-face. Training and development was definitely hard to manage. And this came back very clearly from our feedback from our employees. Though I'm not sure that this is entirely down to remote working. I think this is an area as an organisation that we haven't invested enough time and effort into tuning up. So I'm actually got a programme in place at the moment to look at our whole process of reviewing people and planning their development. Employee and employer relationships. I think relationships weakened with remote working. And I think this was a particular issue for new employees, where they maybe didn't build their strong relationships with their colleagues, which meant that if another job came along, they didn't feel a lot of buy-in to us as an organisation. And as an example of this, I had It was actually a recruit who we recruited. Well, stage 1 interview was face-to-face. Stage 2 interview was in lockdown, so it was remote. And then they were recruited and they joined us, and they left us a year later. And in that time period, they met no one face-to-face. Some of that was lack of inclination on their part, because there were opportunities to have face-to-face meetings, even outdoor meetings, through some socials. We tried to arrange socials at various points where it was opportune to at least have some kind of meeting up, particularly summer 2020, when we weren't in lockdown, but they avoided those overall. But I guess when you've never met anyone, if you're feeling a bit shy, maybe introverted, you might not leap to take up those opportunities either. So we definitely saw drift in relationships, and particularly with new recruits as well. Organisation culture. Well, because of the drift in relationships, I do feel that gives a weakening in culture. But actually, we performed really well through this period. It was an incredibly busy period for us as an organisation. And the feedback that came about our more recent employee survey shows that actually some of the core elements of culture were actually pretty well preserved and played really well for us. So from my perspective, it's kind of a neutral on this, some good, some bad. Managing employee benefits. So a lot of this is more focused obviously on kind of HR administration tasks. We have an online in the cloud HR system, so it's super easy for those to be managed from anywhere. You know, people can apply for leave, it can be approved, all of that stuff just works seamlessly. So that was great. Creating a safe working environment. Obviously working from home was to make people's environments safer from a COVID perspective, but we then spent time to talk with people about what they needed in terms of maybe extra equipment to support them, and the managers really kind of stepped up as well, doing very regular check-ins with employees around mental well-being, recognizing that it was a more stressful situation for everyone really. So I feel we did really well in that area. Handling disciplinary actions, for me this was a bit mixed. I think the issue here is that performance issues take longer to identify when you never get to directly observe somebody in the working place. And we definitely had this with one of our hires. They got through their probation. I wouldn't say with flying colours, but they did enough to get through it. But then pretty soon after that, we started to see a deterioration in performance. I would question whether they were actually spending all of their working day committed to working for us. They had what I call it a side hustle prior to joining us. They said they were going to stop that. I don't think they did. And those types of things, they're just really hard to get a sense of when somebody's remote all the time. So for that reason, we were slow getting onto it. We did end up moving into a formal disciplinary cycle. The disciplinary actions then, as in terms of, you know, interviews, documentation, things like that, they actually all worked super well remotely using Zoom. And actually we were able to use the recording function of Zoom to create obviously verbatim records of the meetings, which was actually super helpful. And then organisation performance, as I said before, it was a really busy period for us. Lots of charities obviously had to move to working from home, so we were helping them to do that. There were also a lot of income challenges as charities cancel face-to-face events, so we were helping them to get more digital, to do digital fundraising, things like that. So that meant it was a super busy period for us there, and the organisation and all of our employees did really well in terms of stepping up and giving the charities the support they needed. So I said I'd talk about culture points. These are from the survey I mentioned. So this is what employees said. This was an anonymous survey that was done by a third party, so I don't know who said what, but I was actually really pleased with this. So, you know, 92% of employees saying they're encouraged to give high performance, 85% saying they participate in the decision making with others in the organisation, so that shows that they were really very engaged. 85% said work is interesting, uses their skills and capabilities. 85% we're always seeking new ways to improve, and that's a really important point to me. We're often introducing new services, new content types, and they don't always work right first time, so we need to kind of tune and improve. So that kind of ethos of continually improving, that's really important to me. And we're genuinely supported if we choose to make use of flexible working. So I was actually super pleased with all of those points. And from my perspective, I feel that these were the positive culture points that enabled us to continue delivering at a high level during what was obviously a very challenging level for everyone in the country and a very challenging point in time for our organisation. So I mentioned objectives and key results earlier, and these are, I guess, one of our fundamental management methodologies that we use to keep focus and momentum in the organisation. Many of you are probably familiar with these, but if you're not, they were initially popularized by Andrew Grove at Intel in the 1970s and 80s, and then Google picked them up. One of their venture capitalists actually kind of introduced them to it in the noughties and into the 10s, and they underpinned a lot of their hyper growth over that period. For me, there's a number of elements here. So collaborative goal setting tool, used to set challenging and ambitious goals. So the aim is there's real stretch in those goals. And even if you don't maybe hit the stretch, in reaching for the stretch, you can significantly extend where you might have got to otherwise as an organization. It's all about tracking progress, aligning, and encouraging engagement around those objectives. And the goals have to be measurable. So we have our objectives and key results, which we set quarterly. Some of them are in the same area, but evolve on with new numbers each quarter. And these are what we get together and discuss every morning in our, what is now an all hands Zoom call. And the employees contribute to updating these. So the employees actually have to go off and source the data that underpins these. And from my perspective, it works, and it works for the very simple reason that you get what you measure. So those things that you measure every week and look at every week as an organization typically improve because they remain in the spotlight and in everybody's focus. Now, I don't think that their use in charities is particularly common. The reason I brought them in was my last chair. He actually used them very actively within his business. He found them useful. So I thought it would be a really great way of supporting charity digital through a significant period of change. We've actually been changing quite a lot since I joined in 2018. So this was a good way of underpinning those changes and reviewing and updating on a quarterly basis. Let's go to the next slide. So the OKRs were really important in terms of helping to underpin performance and sustaining this culture of improvement and performance, really. Other key enabler for successful remote working, and it kind of goes without saying, is enabling technology. So we were very lucky to have all of this. I guess you might expect that given what we do as an organization. So we had an extensive cloud infrastructure with software as a service solutions in place pre-pandemic. So we had Office 365 and Teams. It was already rolled out to all employees. We have an online HR system. We have an online finance system. We use Xero in this area. We also have Zoom. We don't have that for every employee, but we found that that's more useful maybe for very large meetings. It's easier for people to jump in and out of. We have various external websites. Our main informational and educational site is called Afino. It's the Afino platform, and that can be all edited and maintained remotely. And the product technology site is called the Exchange, Charity Digital Exchange, and again, that can all be remotely managed. And our phone system, so we'd already moved this to be an IP-based phone system, so there's no kind of switch that needs to be managed and maintained. And what that means is that people can log on anywhere to their phone. You know, they can be in the office, they can be at home, they could be somewhere else, and they can just log in through their laptop, or if they're using desktop, they can also log in through that. So all of those things meant that actually people could access any of the communication services and systems that they needed wherever they were pre-pandemic. And actually, you know, on the day we switched over to working from home, that was very seamless. We did have to do a little bit of upgrading of equipment. You know, some people didn't have suitable laptops at home, so we bought those for them, maybe some screens, things like that as well. So that was our experience of remote working. Before I talk a bit more about how we've implemented blended working, I thought it might be useful to just talk about what each of you see as the main barriers to blended working in your organisation. So we've got a poll for this as well, and it's on the screen now. So we've got 5 choices here as well. So do you see the main barrier as leadership, communication, employee involvement, tech infrastructure, or other? And if you're going to tick other, can I ask you to put something in the chat just to kind of explain what you mean by that? So we'll just wait for the results to come through on this one.
Get your votes in. Not as quick off the mark on this second poll. So those options again, what are the main barriers to blended working in your organisation? Leadership, communication, employee involvement, tech infrastructure, or another option. And if it's other, please pop a message in the chat. Just over half of you voted so far. I'll give you 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close the poll and share the results. Can say 50% of our audience said the tech infrastructure was their biggest challenge, and 25% each said communication and employee involvement, and nobody voting for leadership or for another challenge. There's some quite interesting results, Jonathan.
Okay. Yeah, so it's a little bit difficult to interpret that. So does that mean leadership wasn't a barrier because it was just really great? Or they don't think it's a barrier overall? Because I think it's super important. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Obviously, communication, employee involvement come up, and tech infrastructure. It's interesting to see that tech infrastructure still comes up. I guess from my perspective, I'd hope that everybody might have nailed their tech infrastructure through the period of lockdown and remote working. But I'll talk more about that as well. So let's move on to the next slide. So yeah, so making blended working work. For me, there are some fundamentals, and actually the fundamentals are largely in there as we just looked at in the survey. I start with leadership, and it kind of overlaps with vision as well here. I think it's the role of leadership to actually stand back and say, how do we want blended working to work in this organisation? So for me, this was a matter of saying, well, it's important for me to get people into the office enough for them to, one, have some team time, but also I don't want to have very strict silos where, you know, I mentioned it before, where maybe half the people in the organisation never meet the other half. That's not productive in terms of generating cross-working and cross-fertilisation of ideas. So I wanted to make sure that we got that, but also I did recognise that from a kind of employee well-being perspective and work-life balance, enabling people to work from home maybe more than just the one day a week we had before was actually a good thing. And I'd seen that because we'd performed well through the whole period of lockdown, actually over 18 months of having people working from home, I'd seen that we'd performed well then. So there's no case for kind of saying the organisation can't perform unless I have everybody in the office nearly all the time, because clearly it had performed well. So I wanted to be able to give people that better work-life balance when they're not losing, you know, maybe up to a couple of hours a day traveling in and out of the office. I also had an environmental factor here. You know, I mentioned at the outset we'd grown from 15 to 19 people. I no longer have desks for everyone. I can't have everybody in the office together on the same day because there's not a seat for them. Secondly, linked to that, because there is still an ongoing COVID risk, I didn't want that office more than 50% full. I wanted lots of spacing, also want it ventilated as well, with a window, so that we can minimize the risks for people coming in. So all of those kind of considerations for me, they kind of come from the leadership. I think HR can advise on them, but ultimately the leadership of the organization kind of needs to say how they want things to be. And that then takes us to the second point, which is around the expectation setting. So having decided how you want it to work, you've got to make it very clear to people. So for us, it was a matter of saying, yep, you need to come in a day a week for your team meeting, and that's on this day, no choice on that. And you need to then pick one other day, and that's entirely down to you. And so we communicated this at a reasonably early stage, well, at a very early stage before we returned. When we reviewed what was actually happening in terms of office attendee, it appeared that didn't actually sink into everyone, so we actually had to reiterate that communication as well. And we're now at the point where, yeah, everybody is now following that pattern. You know, and some people like to come in on a Monday because it's quieter from a travel perspective. Some people have asked to flex their time because they want to travel more off peak. So some people now come in at 8 and work to 4:30. The core hours for us are 9 to 5:30. So we've had to be kind of talk about these things and be quite flexible, but do it with a clear expectation of what the minimum is. And in terms of other elements of communication, you know, talking about things that aren't working. So one of the things that became clear after a while was that the office, and this is quite, I guess, low level in terms of an issue, but it still needed to be addressed. The office had become quite a mess. I think the reason it become quite a mess was, you know, people just dropping in occasionally through the period of lockdown and beyond. Kind of created a low sense of ownership for the shared space. And then when people were still going in 2 days a week, it still doesn't create that sense of ownership. But I believe a kind of a really messy environment's not very constructive to good working. And quite a number of people didn't like that. So we had to start to talk about that problem. And then actually we delegated down. We got some employee volunteers to work out how we were, both what the standards would be, for keeping the space clean and tidy, and also to arrange a tidy up. You know, in the old world, you might have just done a kind of an all hands thing, just sort it out in a very short period of time with everyone there, but we didn't have a day with everybody there. So it's a matter of actually coordinating that across teams. So it actually took a couple of weeks, but we did get there. But things like that, rather than kind of try and work it all out kind of at a senior level, or take it off and say it's an HR issue, I think it's best to get the people who are living in that environment to kind of work out the detail and make it work, which we've done. And then obviously tech infrastructure, which I'll talk about a bit more. Let's go to the next slide, talk a bit more about the details of making blended working work. So clear COVID policy. Obviously, we're still in a period of COVID. There's quite a high caseload out there. I think we all know that. And some employees are really concerned about this. So one of the things we had to put in place was, this is our COVID policy. COVID policy requests. We actually can't mandate this because that's not our right as an employee, but we ask that all employees do a test at least once a week. That felt like a reasonable balance. We ask that if they have any symptoms, any illness, we don't care whether it's a COVID illness or not. If they have any illness, we just say, don't commit. We don't want you in the office if you're ill. We don't want you spreading it around. So things like that are a part of COVID policy. I've talked about team days already. Yeah, how do we actually manage the space? Well, you obviously need an office booking process. We wanted something that was super easy. We just do this with Exchange, with Outlook. So we've got a shared calendar, and you just go onto that calendar and you book the days you're going to go in. And that's what I meant when I said earlier about first come, first served. It's not the first to physically get to the office, it's the first to make the bookings that get those. If you want to come in and we've already reached our maximum, because we have a serviced office which has a it has a communal lounge area all tenants are allowed to use, then actually, if you can't get in the office, you can choose to go and work in that overflow space as well, though we can't manage how crowded that space will be. We've banned hybrid meetings. We played around a bit with this before. Obviously, we did our all hands stand up, but sometimes we'd have people who couldn't make it on a Monday and they'd dial in. I think the experience was pretty rubbish for them. And I've been on the other end of hybrid meetings and I don't like being on the other end. So actually we said, look, this worked really well as a virtual meeting all through lockdown. We're just going to keep this meeting virtual. So Monday mornings for that reason. Everybody's on the call now for that. Those who want to do a call from the office can. Those who are working from home can join it as well. And obviously the tidy office I've mentioned. So let's move along. So just want to loop back around on the technology. So I talked about the importance of having those enabling technologies. And one of the super important things is making sure that those are secure. And I think there's two aspects to this. One is a very people-focused aspect, and I'll talk about this. And the other aspect is very much around tools and the role of IS. So quickly running through the types of things which I think are important in tooling. Endpoint protection, you might know this more as kind of an antivirus software. So things like Norton, Avast, Bitdefender, things like that. They're really important. They keep the machines that people are logging onto secure. They hopefully stop them accidentally downloading viruses and other malware. So that's important. Message filtering is something you can put on your email system, kind of at the front end, which will actually identify potentially phishing emails and take them out of the system so they don't get to the employees. Preferably quarantine them, but if they don't do that, stick them at least in spam. Multi-factor authentication, again, for those who aren't technical, by this I'm meaning as well as having your normal password log on, having the system then maybe send you a text. That's the prime example. Send you a text with a code in, where you then enter the code on the screen, which means that anyone who doesn't have your phone can't access the system. So that's a really great way, particularly on critical systems like finance systems and systems that contain personal details. Remote access policies, so you can lock down access to your system so that people who are trying to access maybe from countries where you have no employees can't get in. They can be circumvented with a VPN, but you still block some attacks. And actually we did have an attack earlier this year, and when we analyzed the logs afterwards, we found out that the person had been accessing from the US. So if we had locked down better our system, we would have stopped that at that point. And patch management. So again, you'll all have experienced your machine trying to download updates at various points in time. Normally those updates are normally actually security updates to make your machine more secure. If you're not downloading and applying those, you are more vulnerable. Patch management software, which would be centrally deployed, is just a way of centrally checking that all these updates are being applied. So it's a fairly simple tool set. And the importance to me is, I don't actually think it's fair to say that all the onus of avoiding security breaches should be on the employee. The employee is part of the mix, but it's really our responsibility to make sure we're giving them the tools and deploying tools centrally that protect them as much as possible and reduce the number of attacks and therefore the likelihood of any of these attacks being successful. If you have an IS function or someone who focuses on IS for your organization, they can do additional things. They should monitor for unusual network activity, so strange logons, and inbox rules. So one of the most popular forms of security breach is to get into people's email systems and then try and do things like get fake payments, generate fake invoices to go to fraudulent bank accounts. They do that from within the email system, and they cover their tracks with inbox rules so that replies to their emails go to places which you wouldn't know about. So if you check inbox rules being set up in your organisation, you can sometimes find evidence of breaches that you don't know about. And again, we did have this in our organisation, so I know about this firsthand. Going to the next slide. People are super important in terms of being secure as well. So good culture promotes security. And for me, a good culture is one where there's a lot of openness, so people share information freely, good and quick communication. And so I mentioned Teams earlier. We find the chat function in Teams super useful for kind of throwing around messages really quickly. So if there's anything we want help on, we have a channel called Help. And that's the type of thing, you know, if you've found that you're something strange in your email system, you could just alert everybody in the organization immediately through that help system. Personal accountability is important. So, and it actually partly goes with the no blame culture as well. So if you have a no blame culture, people find it easier to stand up and be accountable, so that if an employee does mistakenly click on a link that looks a bit dodgy and they realize, the last thing you want them to do is cover that up. You want them to come forward and be very open about that and get help so it can be contained. And again, this was my personal learning when we had our breach with the which related to an action that one employee had taken. We don't know exactly what that action was, but it was super important not to give that employee a hard time, because the message that would have gone out for anyone else was, if a breach is linked to you, you're going to be in trouble. So I really didn't want that to be the sense and the feeling. It needed to be, yeah, bad things happen. They can happen to any of us. And therefore, let's work together to contain and fix this bad thing. And then actually the things at the bottom around training and testing, well, let's make sure that we're training people enough to avoid these problems, telling them what to look out for. And then there's now actually some quite good testing software. It kind of sends fake phishing emails. They're not real phishing emails. It sends them out and sees who clicks on them. And then you can feed back to people to say, do you realize you clicked on this email? You shouldn't have. Just kind of think about what you're doing. Policies, again, you know, kind of encourage people not to download unauthorized software and access sites that they shouldn't. And personal data, this is super important, because you've probably got personal data stored in nice secure systems, so that's great. They're hard for an attacker to get into. But if they manage to breach, say, your Office 365 setup by getting into an email account, and you've downloaded some of that detail of personal details and are sitting in files which are not protected, then actually that can still be part of a security breach. So that's kind of like having policies to say, well, if you do download data, security protect it, delete it when you don't need it, all of those types of good things. Which is the Q&A. So I think just wrapping, for me, you know, good blended working comes from really reflecting on what was the best of remote working and work well. How do we roll that forward into the new blended working? But how do we also reflect on the things we didn't like, and how do we eliminate those and get the best of face-to-face working as well? And for me, it's that kind of like a combination of, you know, having thought it all through from a leadership perspective, clear expectation, communication setting, having the right technology, and involving the employees in solving problems. You know, our predominant approach is don't overthink. It's kind of set the envelope, but then actually work out, because you can never anticipate every problem in advance. So try and be agile and rapid in terms of how you respond to issues and engage the employees in then responding to those problems and issues as they arise. So we've got some time for questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jonathan. Really appreciate you being so candid and open about your experience moving to blended working at Charity Digital, and also for showing your expertise when it comes to things like the right tech to use, and particularly around information security, which is so important, but not something that gets discussed enough probably. Please do send in your questions if you have any for Jonathan, either directly related to the slides or just other things you think you might know about that we can put into the test. I've got some questions to kick us off. So obviously from our poll, a lot of our attendees today said that getting the technology right is still one of their primary concerns when it comes to blended working. How can charities go about ensuring that technology is helpful and an enabler rather than a hindrance to getting their work done?
So I guess if people are saying there are still blockages caused by the technology, it's a matter of reflecting on what those blockages are. So for example, if you haven't got an HR system, then remote administration of holidays and reviews, things like that can be really painful. So look into how you can put those types of solutions in place. And from my perspective, there are a number of good solutions. Cypher is obviously one of them. They're well proven solutions. The core, I guess the core processes have actually been very well established for many years. They're now very robust in terms of operating in the cloud, so people can access them from anywhere. And they're not super expensive. I don't know the precise details of Cypher pricing, but generally they're not super expensive, these solutions. So I think it comes from a review of where are the problems, where are the pain points. If that isn't clear, then engaging in some kind of consultation exercise where people that will actually feedback what isn't working well for them is useful. There'll probably be a view from senior management as well, and blending those two views. And I know that one of the challenges is always cost as well. So for that, it's a matter of actually thinking through what the cost benefit is overall. I think there are a few of those. So in some areas, employees will be more efficient, so they'll be able to get more work done. And one of the real challenges we've seen in the charity sector, but I think it's probably extending more generally as well, is the number of organisations are having to do the same amount of work with less people. And if we don't give people the right tooling to do that work, there's a danger that we kind of burn them out actually, and that becomes self-defeating, because burnt out employees are not productive, they're not effective. They tend to leave if that maintains for too long. And we're now largely in an environment where it's a candidate market. So if you are out there having to recruit people to fill gaps in your organisation, it's hard. I just remember the numbers. Is it 1.5 million people left this country following Brexit and the pandemic together? That is going to have a major impact, and it is having a major impact, as you obviously all realise as HR professionals on this call, on ability to recruit. So I think actually making sure we're giving the right tooling to our employees to do their jobs so they can do them effectively, so they're not burnt out. I think it's actually a strategic issue at the end of the day, because the consequences of not doing that will be severe, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. All the evidence points to employees wanting a consumer grade experience. Like, there should be no reason why the technology you use to do your job is any worse than that you use to send WhatsApps or watch TV or do whatever you do in your spare time with a computer or a smartphone. You would at least expect that standard of technology. And I think it's all too easy to think it's kind of one and done when you implement technology, that you've chosen a system and it was fine, but you don't re-review it over a period, whether that's something like a piece of hardware like a laptop, because everyone's laptops, do they need renewing or updating, or is that the same as your HR system or your communication system? Is it still fit for purpose once you've got it up in place? Even though it's difficult to find the time and the energy to go through these projects, the benefits should be worth it.
Yeah, it's worth also saying, just on the cost side thing, if you are a charity, then we do have a number of deals through Charity Digital where that technology is cheaper if you're registered with us than it would be to other organisations.
Okay, fantastic. And of course, Cypher and particularly our HR products over HR. We work with a number of charities, so if you're interested, you can let us know at the end of the webinar through our exit survey if you'd like to find out more about that or any of our other products. Jonathan, are you able to talk a little bit about the considerations for technology when it comes to volunteers? I get the sense you don't have many or any volunteers at Charity Digital yourself.
Yeah. Volunteers is a really interesting area, actually, because generally I feel they've been a little bit neglected in digital terms by quite a large number of charities. I had a period of about a year when before I came into the sector. So just a little bit more background. So the bulk of my career has been worked in the commercial sector up until late 2016. I decided I wanted to focus, I'm quite old now, so I decided I wanted to focus the remainder of my career on having more social impact, and therefore working in the charity sector. As part of that transition to learn more about the sector, I spent a year volunteering 3 days a week for a relatively small charity based in Surrey. And so I had that experience of being not a peripheral volunteer, being quite a significant volunteer if you look at the amount of time I donated to that organisation. And so I think the challenges partly come from the fact that volunteer is such a broad category, and therefore thinking it through in more detail is probably what's needed, because there are volunteers who are what I'll call one-time volunteers. So it's things like if I go and run the London Marathon, which I did actually do for a certain charity, then I'm a one-time volunteer for that organisation. I raised some money for them on that one day, but I'm not doing anything on a regular basis. I might do the same again a few years later, but I'm not doing something which appears like an employee. So I think there are quite a number of those, and therefore it's worth thinking about them very separately as a community. I think for them it's more about how you communicate with them and keep them engaged and involved. And actually, for that marathon experience, they used a Facebook group. It was actually really good because you feel part of that community of people who come together on that day to run that event. So there's that type of volunteer. Then there's the set of volunteers who are more like a 0 hours contract employee. So these are people who maybe if you're running a food bank, for example, or another service like that, soup kitchen, those types of things. Then you have a lot of volunteers who man those, and you're running that 7 days a week at a fixed time, and you've got shifts that are needed to man those. So you don't need the same people to do that every day. You just need enough people across all of the days of the week, enough people who know what they're doing. So you probably build up a bank of volunteers who man that, and you want to then slot them into shifts. I think the technology has been fairly slow in terms of becoming mainstream for that, but there are now some systems which support that. It's actually an area where we're probably going to run some more content at Charity Digital to explain more about what these options are. So that's the next category. You probably want to do some of the community building around those people as well, but they're not really quite like an employee. But then you get what I was doing when I was volunteering 3 days a week for a year, and actually there was a volunteer in that organisation who'd been volunteering that amount 4 or 5 years. So they had actually been doing that job longer than a lot of the employees. So to my way of looking at that, you treat them like an employee. And actually, if you don't, it actually makes them feel second class. So the only difference between them and an employee is they don't have a contract. They can choose not to turn up on any day they want. so they don't have to book leave and things like that. But for everything else, in terms of how you communicate with them, how you involve them in how your organisation works, my recommendation is you actually treat them like an employee, and they should therefore have the access to technology that any other employee should have as well, because they're probably doing something pretty substantial for you on that time, and they need the support and the access to do that, and they need to feel really valued and bought in, because you're not paying them, so the only reason they're doing it is because they feel valued at the end of the day, and because they obviously want to help your cause. So quite a long answer there, but I think that's because it's quite a nuanced area, volunteer managing, and worth thinking through in that detail.
Certainly for those long-term volunteers, there is much of a flight risk as your employees when it comes to technology, and the barriers to exit are even lower, so there's no contract to break. They could just, as you say, just not turn up. So you've got to treat them even better, as some people might say.
Exactly.
Okay, lovely. Well, that brings us to the end of our time for our broadcast today. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for sharing your expertise with us, and thank you everybody for attending. I really appreciate it. If you want to find out more about Cypher's people management solutions or about charity digital services, there'll be a quick exit survey at the end of this broadcast, so you can just opt in to find out more information, and someone from either team as appropriate will be in touch with you. The survey also asks you for a little bit of feedback about today's broadcast, which will help us shape future webinars. So thank you everybody once again for joining us, and we hope to see you at another Cypher webinar in the future. Thank you, take care, bye.
Thanks, bye.